I'm really sad that I'm not there in person. It's COVID that I'm not there in person, and it sounds like maybe that's probably for the best, given that COVID seems to be a problem in Essex as well. Anyway, really excited to share this research with you all, which I will do. And hopefully that's shared my screen. Brilliant. Okay, so I'm excited to give today's seminar in your life sciences series. I think the research that we're involved in marine fields at the moment, Anna and Ian as well, we're really starting to move beyond the sort of this single systems approach where we're just concerned about fish stocks, or we're just concerned about cetaceans or pinnipeds, other marine mammals, and really starting to think about the interactions between these two systems and how they can be complex and really influenced by people and people's preferences. So I'm going to present some of my group's work on marine human wildlife conflict today. Let me check that I can advance through slides. So I don't know if I'm preaching, maybe I'm preaching to the converted a bit more here, but often when I'm talking about human wildlife conflict, I have this expectation that people would really like me to trot out photos of lions and elephants and tigers and wolves. There's an expectation that this is a problem that really happens in terrestrial environments. When we're talking about human wildlife conflict, what we're really dealing with is this problem between people and wildlife. And actually various sort of branches of human wildlife conflict research have started to focus on problems really between people and people. But at its root, what we come back to is this essentially systems where people, human communities are in conflict for shared resources with another human community, but also another sort of non-human animal community. And at least from the management perspective, this becomes really difficult because effectively we have to manage people's behavior, and people are really complex beings, and understanding why they are in conflict or what their objectives are can be really difficult. So the other problem we have in human wildlife conflict is that we come up against some really big global policies which can often be competing. So when I talk about big global policies in this arena, the big ones we really have to worry about are protection for marine mammals. So since the 1970s, we've seen this really strong appetite for marine mammal protection around the world. So this, apologies, I've switched environments. We're now firmly back in the marine environment. So in the marine environment, we have this real strong global appetite for marine mammal protection. And we've seen that expressed through a whole raft of protection policies that have sort of popped up around the world. And the biggest of these is probably the US Marine Mammal Protection Act. On the other hand, we have this other sort of really big global agenda to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. So these are goals which really focus on improving the livelihoods, the welfare of smaller, more vulnerable human communities. And often those human communities are engaged in these sort of primary production. They're in agriculture, they're in fisheries, and really I shouldn't describe their livelihoods as marginal, but usually they're not operating with large sort of profit margins. They're not very engaged in activities which provide them with large amounts of wealth and income that can allow them to resist, sort of buffer them against any shocks they might face. So apologies as I try and avoid economics lingo here. But here, this becomes really problematic for us in marine settings. And what we tend to lack is an understanding of how advancing one goal, marine mammal protection, makes it more difficult to advance another goal, so improving the livelihoods of human communities. And really, we're lacking some quantitative data in this area. So what we've seen in the marine environment is that prior to our global appetite for marine mammal protection, really we had centuries of whaling and harvesting of other marine mammals. This is through the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And what we saw pretty much around the world is this sort of universal decline in marine mammal populations. And that's estimated at a sort of average figure of a 71% decline relative to historical abundances. So we effectively wiped out the large majority of our marine mammal populations. What's important though is that fisheries activity continued and actually increased in the same period, right? So we go back to a fishing industry which is used to operating in waters, this becomes key, with very low marine mammal populations. Okay, so then in our 20th century, we started to see this protective legislation, and this crucially has really reversed the declines in many of these marine mammal species. And sea lions and seals are a very special case of this. Because of their population structure, their demographic dynamics, these are populations which tend to recover more quickly than other marine mammals. And so what we've seen is that as marine mammals populations have increased, we're starting to get more conflict with fisheries. And sometimes this is communicated as novel, it's sort of an emerging problem, but really this is just a cyclical re-emergence of a problem that's occurred throughout our sort of history of shared use of our ocean spaces. But it's new for our generation, so it feels like this new and emerging problem. So on the one hand, we've got our marine mammal populations like sea lions and seals. They've been at very low levels and they're recovering. This is a conservation success and it's great. And on the other hand, we come back to this human element where a lot of our small scale systems, particularly small scale fisheries, are operating in waters where there's now very large marine mammal populations. And this can present some really big challenges for fisheries, but also for managers, because managers are still have to abide by these marine mammal agreements, but they're also committed to improving welfare outcomes for their more marginal elements of society. So I share this video with you to give you a bit of a graphical demonstration of what we're up against when we're describing conflict or marine human wildlife conflict. So these are stellar sea lions. This is in Alaska. This is a video just off YouTube of a fisher. You can see the nets are in the water and it's sort of a feeding frenzy of stellar sea lions. So when we say that this is a real problem for fishers, hopefully this gives you an idea of the magnitude of the problem that they're up against and why it can be really quite frustrating for fishers to be operating in these areas. So where are our marine mammals found? And when I'm going to be talking about marine mammals now, we're going to shift our focus to pinnipeds, which are these sea lions, seals, and walruses. So this is a distribution of pinnipeds around the world. This is all IUCN data. And as you can see, we've got our different species in different colors, but generally what we see is a really strong coastal focus. Out of our polar regions, where we find pinnipeds is on the coast. And this is because for the majority of these animals, they're coming on. They're usually giving birth on some form of land. And depending on the species, the pups need to stay on land for up to 3 weeks or longer. And so that means that they're really sort of tied to these coastal environments. The next question for you is, where do we find the highest concentrations of fishing activity in the world? And I think most of you can see where we're leading with this. So this is, these are two figures, the top one's from Cruz Myrtle and Science in 2018. And what we're seeing here is concentration of fishing effort. So this is where are our fishing boats most often located. So darker purple indicates higher concentrations of fishing effort. And basically what we see here is that it's very highly coastally based. The bottom figure here is from, I should look at my screen, apologies, instead of my second screen. The second figure is from Hicks et al. In 2019 from Nature. And this time we're looking at what's being pulled up out of the water. So this is catch in millions of tons per year, and darker purple areas indicate areas with higher catch levels. And once again, we have this really strong coastal focus. We compared this to where our sea lions and seals are found. And apologies, I've got a fly buzzing around me. So there's no surprise here. We have this really strong overlap with where our sea lions and seals are found and where our fisheries activities are really located. So around the world, we see different communication of the problems that this overlap causes. In Australia, a sort of South Australian fur seal tends to interact with different gears. This is just a random assortment of examples from a meta-analysis that we're currently doing to understand what is the economic damage caused to fishers of their interactions with pinnipeds, and also how likely is it that they will have interactions with pinnipeds in any given day of fishing. So these estimates really show that there's this huge variation in the scope of the problem for different fisheries. So in California, for example, they've estimated that they've lost up to 84% of commercial catch because of interactions with the Californian sea lions. On the other hand, it could be as low as sort of 0 or 1 to 2% of catches lost. So really variable impacts, but with the potential to be very problematic. So the research questions that we're going to look through today is specifically thinking from a manager's perspective, what is motivating conflict on the ground for fishers, so that when we're thinking about management, we've got a better idea of how to address these problems. And then two, what is this impact of pinnipeds like sea lions and seals on fishers' welfare? So is the general unrest caused by marine human wildlife conflict, is there a scientific basis for it? So the area of the world we're going to take you today, which will be familiar for some of you, is Peru and Chile. So this is the west coast of South America. This is right on the Humboldt Current, a very rich area for marine resources. So Peru is number 3 in the world in terms of marine capture fisheries, shared with Indonesia, and Chile, I think, is currently number 10. So these are mighty fishing nations, Chile and Peru. And importantly, they have very large, small-scale coastal fishing fleets. So they're operating in these parts of the coast where our sea lions and seals are also located. So this conflict in Chile and Peru has been increasing in recent years. This is a newspaper article from 2018 in Chile, talking about this dramatic fight between fishers and sea lions for food. And this is the sort of media sensationalism of this problem, but because we are looking at small-scale fishers, again, it does come down to this almost you or me and narrative. So the South American sea lion is the main problem species in this part of the world. The South American fur seal is the other species which is commonly found here, and they're generally in much lower numbers, and so they don't tend to interact with fishers as much. South American sea lion is this highly charismatic, very attractive individual. They are protected species in both Peru and Chile, and that protection is kind of up for renewal in Chile at the moment. But both of these countries export fisheries products to the US. So for any of you who work in fisheries, that means that they're bound by the clauses of the US Marine Mammal Protection Act, and they cannot intentionally hurt or cause damage to sea lions or seals or other marine mammals. So what we've seen with this particular species in this part of the world is that their behavior has really changed. And this is what makes working with pinnipeds really interesting and challenging. We can't sort of assume a linear scaling of population size to fisheries impacts, because sea lion behavior changes when they're in the presence of fisheries. And how that behavior changes and over what time frame really determines how much they interact with fisheries. So these animals, instead of foraging themselves, have now sort of developed this sit and wait for the fishing boat behavior. And this is what's making them really frustrating for fishers. So fishers sort of describe the typical dinner bell effect, where the nets are coming up and one sea lion becomes 20, and suddenly it becomes very difficult for the fishers. So the recent history of this animal in this part of the world, Peru on the left-hand side and Chile on the right-hand side. So these animals have come from sort of history, again, centuries of exploitation in these two countries. Populations were at very low levels in the 1970s, late 1960s. And what we've really seen is this very strong population increase since this point. Remember, for most, well, to think about this, the average age of many fishers operating in this part of the world is about 40 to 50. That means that when the majority of fishers began their activities or entered the industry, these populations were at really low levels. So through their working life, they've seen this veritable explosion in these animals. And that really, as you'll see, has really shaped how they interact with these animals and their perceptions of what should be done. So what we did in this research then was to survey fishers in these areas and understand what it was that needed to be solved. What was the big problem that they had with sea lions? It's been a really contentious issue, and we sort of went in a priori expecting that it was going to be an economic problem, and that offering fishers compensation, as is done in many Scandinavian countries, for damage incurred by sea lions, was going to sort of solve the problem. So we went in with it, we surveyed 300 fishers, 17 locations in Chile, 10 survey locations in Peru. We used a best for scaling survey, which I'll go through in shortly. And we picked up some other data on their attitudes and socioeconomic characteristics. So we, through various workshops and working groups and from the literature, we put together a list of 12 reasons that we thought might really be what was driving conflict between small-scale fishers and sea lions. And these range from concern that For example, sea lions will damage nets, and so fishers have to spend more money and time repairing nets. Because of sea lion impacts, fishers are having to travel further offshore to catch, and that means that there's some safety concerns because conditions are less safe fishing further offshore. So if anyone's interested, this is a form of discrete choice experiment, Verswise scaling. It's used in a variety of contexts. And what we're really doing is identifying from a list of attributes what's most important and what's least important from fishers. This helps us from a policy context, because then we can go back and say, of all the problems we need to address, this is the top one. So we have 8 different survey versions. I see 12 questions in total. And what these surveys look like is this. So we've got a stack of 12 things we think might be driving conflict. We're going to pick 4 of them for any given question, and then ask the fishers to pick out what they think is most important from this list and least important. And we do that because generally, as people, we are very good at picking out what's most and least important, and we're not very good in the middle. So to get a more accurate sort of breakdown of the relative importance of these attributes, we can use methods like this. So, drum roll, the results that we found, what was really important for fishers in this part of the world, the top spot didn't go to economic impacts. The top spot actually went to this perception that the populations of these animals were just too large. And again, when we come back to this, well, we know how long fishers have been operating for, we know what's happened to the populations of these of sea lions in this period of time. That's kind of understandable. And then, of course, we're also concerned about economic costs. So spending more money to repair damaged gear or getting less money for damaged catch. So these results are useful from the perspective of policymakers to a certain extent to say, on average, what does my population think? But we don't really expect homogeneous preferences over any group of more than one individual. So what we can use are different methods to identify sort of groups of respondents within our surveyed population who've got similar but different preferences. So we can use models which are a scale adjusted latent class model in this case to understand some of these heterogeneity and the preferences of the fishers that we interviewed. And what we found 4 groups of fishers who had sort of consistent preferences within their groups. And for the majority of these groups, 3 of these groups, this concern about population size was still their chief concern. But then we can start to unpack a little bit more heterogeneity in these groups. So for some of these groups in our bottom left, our blue corner, other problems for these fishers were these concerns about safety, problems with safety because they're having to travel further offshore. They're also more concerned about the extra time they're spending away from families in order to mend gear, etc., etc. Whereas in our top left-hand corner, our green group are more concerned about these economic costs, and they're concerned about how much more they're having to spend on inputs. I'm about to give you some categorizing names for these groups of people. Before I do, we can use information that we have about the characteristics of our individuals, our fishers who we surveyed, and then we can understand whether having these attributes makes them more or less likely to belong to our, apologies for the jargon, our scale adjusted latent class groups. So our groups of fishers who've got different thoughts, feelings, we can understand how likely fishers are to be in those different groups based on characteristics such as, are they involved in sea lion tourism? That ended up being a really significant predictor of this class membership. What they thought about the impact of sea lions on earnings and whether they were from Peru or Chile. So for example, in what we came to call our economically minded group, respondents were far more likely to think that sea lions had a negative impact on catch and earnings. They were far more likely to be from Chile. Whereas in our what we called alternative livelihoods group, respondents were far more likely to be involved in sea lion tourism or to know someone who was. And then our other groups, we had this lifestyle impacts group who really concerned about the extra time they're spending fishing. And then finally, we had our capacity focus group who I'll get into. And why we care about this information, how is it useful to know about the feelings and preferences of different groups of fishers in our sample, is that when we're coming to management solutions, we can tailor our management solutions to these different groups in the population. So for some, for example, the majority of our survey, population culls is actually if we had complete freedom to act, would probably be the best solution to resolve conflict with sea lions from their perspective. Whereas for our alternative livelihoods group, providing support to transition them into marine mammal ecotourism could be a better strategy. For other groups, maybe economic incentives will be most appropriate. And then for still others, providing support for capacity building. So because of sea lions, we have this impact on gear and we have this impact on catch. And fishers really need to sort of chop and change their fishing strategy in order to minimize these impacts. And for some fishers, that can be quite confronting. It means that they don't have an optimal strategy that they can stick with. They're constantly having to redo how they function, how they work. I'm just going to give everyone a short breathing break. COVID has had its impact on my lungs. I always feel a bit sad for taking that video off. It's quite nice, quite soothing. So coming back to this story that we have in Peru and Chile, we have an understanding of what is driving conflict from fishers' perspective. What we can then go to see is what fishers perceive is the impact of sea lions, first on their catch. So for the majority of fishers, what we see is that they think they're losing at least 26% of their catch because of sea lion interactions. So this figure here is showing impact on catch on the horizontal, and the number of respondents who identified that as the impact of pinnipeds, sea lions on catch on the vertical. So the dotted line is sort of the zero mark. So estimates left of the dotted line are negative impacts, and estimates right of the dotted line are positive impacts. So you can see the majority of fishers really think they're losing very large proportions of their catch because of sea lions. The important thing to bear in mind here is that these are perceptions. This is not independent observers on board. This is what fishers are reporting as the impact of sea lions on our catch. It's a really similar story for income. Again, these highly negative impacts, the same structure here, impacts on the horizontal axis and number of respondents on the vertical. And you can see most respondents think they're losing sort of these really large percentages of their catch because of sea lions. So this has all been a very sort of social focused story, concern about the fishers. The flip side, of course, is that we're concerned about the impacts of this conflict on our sea lion populations. So remembering that these are protected species, remembering that these populations are recovering after sort of centuries of exploitation, what happens when fishers are in conflict with sea lions? Typically what we tend to see is that fishers are retaliating, which is understandable when they have these really large perceived negative impacts. So typically fishers are defending their catch from sea lions. And what we found is that 60% of vessels are probably killing sea lions to protect their catch. We can break down these estimates a little bit. This is illegal behavior, so it's a bit difficult to get a good overview, a good understanding of what's actually happening. But so we're seeing on the left-hand plot here is Peru and the right-hand plot is Chile. So we broke up our respondents into north, central, and southern regions, and we're asking fishers how many sea lions they think other boats in their region are killing each month. So basically what we take from this is that the number is not zero. There's some positive number of sea lions that are being killed by boats each month. These estimates we know are inflated because there's not enough sea lions for this level of illegal killing to be going on, but we know that the sea lions are being killed. So we've got our mean is our little asterisk, and then our line is our standard deviation. And then on the coastline of Peru, these are the ports where we were interviewing, and the size of the port is indicating the number of fishers operating in those regions. And it's the same story for Chile. So I think Peru maybe was an average of 6 sea lions per month, and Chile maybe 7 or 5 sea lions being killed by month by an average boat. These numbers can't be accurate, but we know that some sea lions are being killed. So we come down to this really two-sided story here. We have different perceptions, different sort of sentiments amongst our fishing population, and we can use that heterogeneity to better design management solutions. What we come down to, though, is that the majority of fishers, over 70% of the people that we interviewed, really think that culls, population culls, so killing off some percentage of our sea lion populations, is really what's going to be necessary to reduce their impacts on fishers' income and catch. So culls are this really contentious area for any of you working in human-wildlife interactions. What we tend to think is that culls are really good for letting off steam. They're a very good way of managing sentiment in our human populations. There's almost no evidence that they have any impact on reducing conflict or increasing sort of harvest of a contested resource. There's no evidence for that. What we also don't have evidence for is what would be the impact of culls killing off some percentage of our populations on the dynamics of our still protected, still recovering sea lion populations. And this actually is the next bit of research that I'm going to share with you. So if we were to sort of kill off some given percentage of our sea lion population, what do we think that would do to our population dynamics and the viability of this population into the future? So this time we're just focusing on Chile. We're not looking at Peru. This is a partial map of where sea lions are found on the Chilean coast. And Joaquin, who I think is in the call, has a much better, more accurate map than this. So we're basically missing all the sea lions that are in the south. But so sea lions are distributed along the Chilean coast. And what we'd like to be able to understand is if the Chilean Fisheries Department was to once again start culling or removing some section of this population, what would that do to the population in the future? That's one aspect. The second aspect is that in this part of the world, El Nino events are becoming increasingly frequent and increasingly severe. And we know that these events have really negative impacts on populations of our marine mammals and other marine species. So we can't really assess what would be the impact of sort of a human-based intervention without understanding the broader context of where these animals are. This is more important for sea lions and seals because we know that the population dynamics of these species can move around very quickly. So research up here in the top from a colleague in Sweden, Karen Harding, in their population is responding to different threats. Usually it's some form of disease, zoonotic disease, which is knocking out large percentage of their population. So it's not climate. But what they found is that seemingly stable populations of harbor seals can really flip very quickly. So when they were looking at whether they could start hunting these populations, again, to manage human-wildlife conflict, they needed to know how likely that hunting was to sort of push their populations into sort of a free fall. And similar in other parts of the world, similar analyses are going on in South Africa and also in Canada. So we'd like to be able to manage conflict between fisheries and sea lions by removing what are seen as populations that are too large, but it's really difficult for us to recommend that from a scientific perspective without understanding how that's going to affect the dynamics of our populations. So to do that, we can use population projection models like matrix population models, which take information on discrete stages of the life cycle. So in the case of sea lions, we're thinking about pups, juveniles, and adults typically. And we want to know how each of these discrete stages, their chance of surviving to the next year, the chance of them surviving to the next year and growing into a bigger sea lion, so transitioning from a pup to a juvenile or a juvenile to an adult, the reproduction rates of our adults, how many small sea lions enter the population each year. And we can use this information to project what our population is likely to do in the future. So in the case of Chile, this probably won't surprise any of you, but we have very limited demographic information available for this species. With working with marine mammals, it's very hard to observe these vital rates, this information about how these populations change through time. So ideally, we would parameterize these models with species or population-specific vital rates. We just don't get to do that, unfortunately. So what we do instead is we take understanding about how the phylogenetic relationships with these animals. So there's another 10 pinniped species for which we do have detailed vital rate data, and we can use models and tools to estimate what we expect would be the vital rates of our target species based on phylogenetic relationships and our trait covariance matrix. So we can infer what the processes, the rates of growth, survival, and fecundity of our target animal based on their phylogenetic relationship with other species and what we know those traits are for those other species. So luckily, we have this demographic information for other pinnipeds in the animal matrix database COMPADRE. And we can, using this information, what we did in this analysis was estimate a distribution of probable vital rates for our target species. And then based on those probable vital rates, this distribution, we can estimate matrix population models. So we're incorporating, we've got large levels of uncertainty here, of course, and we can incorporate that uncertainty into our modeling process. Apologies, I think I'm just starting to lose my voice again. COVID. I will attempt to keep going here. So what we get from this analysis then is effectively what we want to do is say this data started from 2019 and then into the future, in this case took a time horizon of 30 years, what's likely to happen to our population through time. So we start off with roughly 80,000 adults and sort of 20,000 juveniles, and we're just looking at a female life cycle here. Because we've got these high levels of uncertainty, we're not assuming a highly discretized population. We've just sort of removed that in order to have a more robust understanding of how sea lions, which are not yet sexually reproducing, and animals which are reproducing from the female side. So based on what we can best estimate are the vital rates for this species, we expect that actually this population is not exploding as fishers are sort of perceiving, but that instead it's likely that based on the modeling process, we would actually predict that this population is going to start declining and quite severely. So this is what our base case data shows. Each of these green lines is an iteration. So we've drawn this distribution of probable vital rates, estimated matrix populations based on those, and we can use this distribution to estimate uncertainty in our analysis. So each green line is a model iteration, and the average values are in our dark black. So our total populations are in this unbroken line, and then juveniles and adults. So the vertical line crossing the horizontal axis is the point at which we think that this population would decline into a quasi-extinction threshold. So there are not enough, there's not enough genetic variability to allow them to withstand natural processes, etc. in the population. We can then come back to what we thought we would be considering from a management perspective, which is to start culling some of these animals. So we're still having these problems with human-wildlife conflict. So we can look at different culling scenarios. We can make these stage and sex specific. In this case, we're only looking at females. But generally, we would target most of our management actions at adult females because they're coming aboard, they're coming on shore to pup, which makes them very easy targets at guaranteed times of the year. So what happens if we add culls onto our population projections? Basically, we start pushing this population in past this quasi-extinction threshold quicker. So we could think about culling 15% of adult females in year 1. We could do annual culls, or we could do more extreme culls every 5 years. So the next thing, sorry, you can hear my voice coming down smaller and smaller. I think I have a breathing break after this slide. What the next thing we need to do, even though our outlook is not looking very good, and if you were advising managers, you might say to them, we really need to think about these culls because so far they're not looking like a great idea. We mentioned that this part of the world has these really extreme El Niño events, and these extreme El Niño events are moving from frequencies of 1 in every 20 years to more like 1 in every 10 years. And when we've had extreme events in the past, what's happened is we've knocked off 100% of pups and juveniles for 2 years. So we've lost that percentage of the population completely. And there's been a 60% mortality of adult females. And I think fecundity obviously went down to 0 as well. So what happens in this part of the world is basically we sort of knock off large portions of this population at sort of increasingly frequent intervals. And we need to think about those dynamics if we're going to, be assessing management solutions. Okay, so this is probably no surprise to you all. When we introduce these extreme climate events onto our base case scenario, we're not going to think about culling animals at this stage. Again, what we see is that it's just more likely that we're going to push this population into extreme, into this non-viable area. When we combine climate events with managed culls, Again, what we do is basically shift this period of time when we're expecting our population to go quasi-extinct earlier into our time horizon. So what we do take from this when we're going back to managers is to say, we would like more data. It would be much better if these recommendations were based on population and species specific data about the way that these populations grow, reproduce, and survive through time. Based on the best that we can do at this stage, which is to infer this information based on related species. We don't have a very stable population. We know that from other studies anyway. And it looks as if they're not stable enough to support culls or really be very viable into the future anyway. So that means really we need to think about these other management actions, economic incentives. We spoke about capacity building or alternative livelihoods. And I'll come back to this idea that our results are really dependent on our certainty around vital rates. To reduce this uncertainty, what we'd really like is to be able to track our populations through time, understand how individuals survive, grow, and reproduce. What has typically happened for marine mammals, at least, is that usually during the reproduction window, there's someone on a beach counting the numbers of males, females, and pups. And then what we can do is use inverse methods to derive vital rates. On the remote coast of Chile and Peru, that data is really difficult to collect. So what we've seen is basically a push to using unmanned aerial vehicles to collect this data. And this is sort of quicker, faster, there's less disturbance for animals. So this is what my group was doing in November last year. We were up on the Farne Islands, which is in Northumberland. For those of you who don't know where the Farne Islands are, which I didn't when we went. And what we started doing, this is an image from one of our drones. I think this was at maybe 40 meters. And the Farne Islands is actually quite good if we're trying to get numbers of sort of population counts for these species in this area, because there's some sandy parts of the beach. But typically the problem we run into is deciding whether the images we're seeing are describing a rock or a seal. And so now we're solving that problem using thermal imagery. So drones with thermal cameras, and then we can really start to get much better and more accurate population counts for these species. This is just my opportunity to show some really cool footage. So this is the drone coming in on the West Wides in the Farne Islands, and you can really see that these animals just pop. You can see them in the water as well. So, you can see the seals swimming. So basically, one of the big problems we have when we're counting these animals is they jump in the water as soon as you approach them, right? And so it's very hard to observe those animals who are in the water. At least with the thermal drones, we can't get animals which are foraging, but we can get animals which are still close to shore. So this is all very exciting methods coming up to us now. Okay, so our research questions: what is motivating conflict? I think most of the time this seems to sort of replicate various scales around the world. It's this expectation of what populations of these animals should be doing. And in many cases, that's a shifting baseline, which is totally influenced by when fishers began fishing, when there was very low levels of sea lions, seals, whales in the ocean. And now these populations are very large. We think that, well, at least fishers perceive that pinnipeds have these really large negative impacts on their welfare and income. And what we can see for these animals, just based on their demographic sort of histories, they can respond quickly to sort of population disturbance, but they can be very quickly affected by disturbance as well. So we have to be really mindful of these population dynamics and this variability when we're thinking about potential management solutions. So I do a shout out to all of my collaborators and funding in this research. And thank you all for listening to my increasingly croaky voice, and apologies that that is going. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Brilliant. So interesting. Thank you. So I have questions, but I'll let other people go first. Maybe so you can see, there, perfect. I was going to say, close down your screen so you can see people. But does anyone want to start off with a question? That was a great talk. So many things to say. Was that a hand up, anybody? Owen? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, fantastic work. Really nice to see this, like linking ecology to the socio-economic side of things. So it's really interesting. I was just wondering if there's anything to be said on like getting the message across that nature's kind of going to be doing the culling for the managers anyway, and if maybe that perception of the problem is not kind of recognized amongst the fisher folk, and whether getting I don't know, some of this research kind of spread out more along the ground that this is a population in decline and that this is going to become less and less of a problem, and culling is not going to make any difference beyond what's going to be happening anyway, if that's part of the solution to the problem.
That's a really excellent idea, and I hadn't thought of that. We haven't really thought, because there hasn't been so Peru's been sort of Peru tends to have more extreme impacts from these El Nino events, and there's a latitudinal gradient. They're not as bad towards the south of Chile, but there we get sort of bigger disease outbreaks affecting the population. But we haven't sort of thought of that as a strategy, this sort of natural controls of these population as a way of communicating with fishers. There's as you can imagine, it's a slightly sensitive research area to work in with fishers. And it's maintaining that. I think that would be really nice. Well, because if we sort of say, this population's declining, they'll say to us, no, it's not. But if we say we've looked at external variables such as changing climate conditions, and that's going to have this impact, that could be a much better way to approach the problem. It's a great suggestion.
Why do you think there is this misalignment between the perception of the growing problem and the actual realization of a shrinking population?
What I think it comes down to is first this concept of shifting baselines. So fishers, what they estimated, which I didn't present, but they think that basically their interactions have increased by 1% every year in the 40 years that we sort of had data for. But it's so that's a massive increase, taken from when fishers first started fishing, and they may have not had any interactions with sea lions when they went out on the boat. And now it's almost guaranteed that when they go out, they will have some interaction with the sea lion. So that's really affected, I think, this real perception of, these populations are exploding. The other thing that makes it very difficult is that sea lion behavior has changed over the same time frame. So is the state of the fish stocks. So there's three processes going on here. So the relative probability that interactions are going to occur between sea lions and fishers has increased because there's more fishers and there's more sea lions. So it's just more likely based on that. It's also now more likely because the fish stocks, it will surprise you all to know that they have not been increasing over this same time frame. They've been decreasing really quickly. And there's huge conflict in Chile between industrial fishers, which operate after the 4 nautical miles, the other side of the upwelling. So this is, and the artisanal small-scale fishers, they get the upwelling zone. So there's strong competition from industrials sort of fishing the line, as it were, and that's having real impacts on fish stocks. And sort of the perception is that that's because the fish stocks are decreasing, again, the fishers and seals and sea lions are competing over a smaller resource base. So again, it's more likely that they have interactions. Apologies, this is long-winded. The third element is that sea lion behavior has changed over that period of time, and they are far more likely to follow a boat. Then it's lower energetic demands to feed by following a boat than it is to go and forage individually. So it makes perfect sense from the sea lion's perspective. So I think those are the three key mechanisms which have driven this conflict.
Cool.
I'm going to jump on my question there because actually it follows on really nicely from what you were just talking about. And I'm just wondering, like you have these shark suits and pingers to avoid shark interactions with people. Like, is there anything that you can do, like a high-pitched squeal on the boat to keep the sea lions away? Are they experimenting with that?
And so I don't know if anyone in the audience is working in these areas. Yes, they work for like the first couple of weeks, and then there's a learning effect, and then it becomes, so they use the sound of orcas. So killer whales are a natural predator of these animals, and so you have these devices that emit a sound like a killer whale, but the sea lions then work that out, and so you change into a dinner bell. So you started off as a deterrent, and then you're becoming a dinner bell, and that's what they've typically seen. The less FDA approved are explosive devices Yeah, there's been some research in some parts of the world looking at colored lights. It's sort of easier with static gears because you can do more for static gears. You can have these, so in Denmark, they've got, I think for salmon, they've got seal exclusion devices, and they're just a bit more expensive, but you know, there's an economic argument to transition to that gear type. It's a bit harder with nets and long lines. They haven't really found a way of excluding seals from those, apart from having shorter set times. So that, you know, the nets spend less time in the water, which means that's also more expensive for fishers, right? That's more difficult for them. So yeah.
That's cool. I had to have another one, actually, if it's okay for me to jump in. And that is, you know, in fish, there's this kind of general assumption usually that a mature female will spawn every year, but then there's increasing evidence for skip spawning behavior, depending on how the conditions were the previous year. So I just wondered, is that common in seals and sea lions, and would you even know about it? And if not, then could you get a whisker and look at hormone concentrations through time or something like that?
Totally could. So female seals or sea lions will skip a year, definitely. Okay. And after the strong El Nino event, so the 97-98 El Nino event was really strong and really wiped out most of the Peruvian population. That's why there's not problems with fur seals, South American fur seals, because they're still not back from that event, really. And there was reproduction was really affected after those years. There was and really weird behaviors reported. So sort of reproduction levels didn't pick up to sort of 3 years after that extreme event. So, you know, seals definitely chose to sit out even when primary productivities were back up after the El Nino. But in terms of having, that would be really useful in the UK populations, because we have, well, for any populations. Yeah, it'd be really interesting to look at whether we could detect that in hormone levels.
Future project.
It's easier sort of with sea lions will nurse their pups for, oh goodness, some non-trivial period of time, and they stay quite close to their pups, so it's quite easy to sort of go, you know, female let's reproduce this year, female let's reproduce this year. It's the ones that you're not observing because they're in the water, because they're not. So that would be, yeah, really useful.
Do they always come back to the same beach? Like, so, you know, if you have them tagged, you could actually look for the ones that are missing?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
So sea lions at least have really high site fidelity, slightly more, it seems, than UK seal populations. So the sea lions that would work well for. What we found with sea lions is because you tag their flippers and they're going over rocky ground, the tags come out really easily. So they found that in South Africa, that it's quite expensive to tag seals. But, you know, yeah, it'd be tricky with population distributed as widely as it is in Chile, but where you've got more discrete populations, I think tags it'd be really great to see a demographic study that was getting more individual based viral rate estimates using tags. Be great.
Anyone else got a question, Katrina? No, that's really, really fantastic, really interesting. And when you're all better, please come and visit us. We'd love to all kind of go out for a drink sometime and meet you in person.
That'd be lovely. Yep, with a voice that's recovering, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Apologies for that. I've been doing so well recently, but clearly this latest COVID has knocked out my lungs again. Never mind.
Well, we can understand. We can understand it. You sounded great, and I loved, and all the little video montages were actually lovely as well. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and thank you, Katrina. And we'll see you all next week. If you're interested, Katrina, you should come too. We've got ancient DNA specialists coming to talk about ancient fish stocks and shifting baselines, actually. So yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting.
And maybe some stellar sea cows actually as well. It does some marine mammal stuff. Yeah, you should definitely go.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Everyone.
Thank you everyone for coming. Thanks, Katrina. Cheers, Owen. Bye.